morning, and welcome to this special Hot Mess Life Coach announcement. Today is not going to be season 5, episode 12, the discussion on compassion that I'm going to have with Morgan. We're going to have that conversation next Friday at this time at 9 a.m. Eastern time. We were experiencing technical difficulties this morning, so I guess this is the universe's way of saying that we need to have self-compassion on ourselves. We need to have compassion on the people who created this technology. And we would like for you to have compassion on us, because we are not going to be able to have the entire Hot Mess Life Coach episode today or the conversation about compassion. We will, though, have this very important conversation next week at this time at 9 a.m. Eastern. So please tune in then. And in the meantime, send your heart of compassion out to us as we struggle to figure out all the robotics of this crazy system that went wrong this morning. Thank you. We love you. Oh, hold on. I see Morgan here now. So let's see. How did you do this? I literally was like 3 seconds away from signing off and telling our viewers that we were going to move to next week.
I'm sorry.
All right. So okay, scratch all that, everybody. Welcome to Hot Mess Life Coach. And give me a second, since we're doing it for real, I'm going to try to include Instagram. So
this is so fitting.
Okay, streaming, update your stream key. Aha. Oh, what does that even mean? Give me 1 second. Okay. If you're out there and you're not on Instagram, we appreciate you. If you are on Instagram, you can't hear me saying this, but we appreciate your patience.
I guess you just keep trying. I don't know what changed. It still said unable to join, but then I just clicked the button anyways, and then it let me in. So I guess we're breaking rules.
Okay, so being a rule breaker, that's what we're learning is the way to move forward, which makes sense to me.
Yep. In some cases, yes.
Fine. In some cases, let's qualify in some cases with some of the rules.
Yeah. As you would say, Brian, rules are just language.
Rules are just language. Exactly. Okay, so it's saying unable to connect to Instagram. So, I suppose that is where the compassion, that is where we rest our compassion today. Instagram, you will have to watch this later. We are very sorry. We love you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so compassion then, let's get into it, right? What is compassion? Why is it useful? Why bother with it? How did it even come to be? Like, what do we make of this whole thing? Where do we want to begin today?
Do you have your definition that you like to start with?
I do. I actually have so many different definitions. So I guess that's as good a place to start as any. The first thing I guess I'll mention is, in my reading about this, it became clear to me that compassion really is not an emotion either. It's an instinct. Mm-hmm. It's actually like a natural instinct. It's an innate survival reflex, the same way fear is a survival reflex, right? So not all fear, but certain kinds of fear. Certainly anxiety is different and comes from cognition, but that fear of a loud noise, right? That's an innate instinct, and you duck or you run or whatever. And compassion is the same way. It has that automatic intrinsic, like, oh, someone's suffering, I should go help. Like, that's a thing about compassion, which is so cool, that it's like it's not an emotion. It's innate intrinsic quality of the human being, which means we can, from the ground level, then take a load off of that whole, like, we've fallen from grace and we have to earn our way back to heaven and all of that, like, hoopla, mm-hmm. right? Like, that's not it. Like, we're naturally this way, and it's just been covered over by culture and belief and trauma and whatnot. Mm-hmm. I did not get to the definition. I went philosophical instead. So real quick, the definition is this is the definition from the dictionary: deep awareness of the suffering of another, accompanied by the wish to relieve it. And that's the key to it for me. Like, empathy is this deep awareness of the suffering of another, and compassion is different because it's accompanied by that wish to relieve it, the motivation to want to go help. So that's where it starts. That's the root of it all there.
Yeah, and with all the other emotions that we've talked about in the other episodes, we've usually kind of talked about how it's evolutionarily beneficial, and with things that feel kind of negative, like grief and anger and things like that, they feel bad, but they also still help us in some way. But I think with compassion, in contrast, it's pretty obvious how compassion would help contribute to survival or would serve and benefit us. Because if other people have compassion for you, or if you have compassion for others, that all mutually helps everyone survive. We're going to be inclined to help other people when they're struggling, or do something for them when they can't do it for themselves. And that contributes to everyone being able to live longer, more fulfilling, more connected lives.
Yeah. So it makes me like, it's so funny because even as I was doing the reading and as I'm hearing you talk now, like the same question keeps popping into my head, which is like, if it is so natural and such an
Mhm.
inborn state within us, why does it feel so out of reach at times? Why does it
Oh,
feel so invisible within society, right? Like, why is it, how is it that it's a natural instinct and yet that natural instinct is not actually reflected in the world that humans have created, although it's reflected in the rest of the world?
yeah, I actually have a pretty good answer to this from activism, from my times of being doing activist things. The reason that you don't see compassion often in like society in the way that would be natural for human beings to see it is because we receive so much information broadly about the world, that a lot of it gets kind of like simplified. So the human stories, the actual experience of other people gets blurred. If
Mm.
if we can't connect, if we cannot imagine ourselves connecting to another person, we will not feel compassion for that person. And so this is why sometimes when we were in the pandemic, people would talk about wanting to not talk about COVID deaths as just numbers, like because the numbers themselves are kind of like numbing. You're
Mhm.
not actually imagining the people that are passing away unless you are connected to a specific person who was affected by it. And so the numbers, you would think that when you say like this many people are being affected, this many people are um, dying, that would evoke some level of compassion, but it doesn't because it's a number, it's not a person. But
Ah,
when you use stories, when you tell stories, when you share the human experience of what like tangibly is happening, like for example, this is why those ads about dogs, like dogs starving. I forget what the it's like the in the arms of the angels. That
okay.
those commercials, that's why they're so effective because it's showing you like face to face. You have to look at like individual like suffering.
Suffering.
But if you
Yeah.
can't see it, if you can't connect to how another being is feeling individually, it won't trigger that compassion reaction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and what's coming to mind is, like, I always think of that story about the girl, the little tiny girl who stood in front of the tank and stopped it from moving forward to, like and,
Yeah,
like, change the course of that whole war, and yet I can't remember even which war it was, and, like,
yeah,
that's an indication, right? Like, I can remember the story, and
yeah.
my compassion wells up for that story about the girl, but I don't remember the larger historical context. That's just because, like, maybe I didn't pay enough attention that day, but, like, the
Mhm.
point is, right, it's the story has grounded me, and, like, I'll never forget that story, but
Yeah.
I can forget the details. So it's like the numbers, the numbingness, right? Like the details fall away, but the stories remain. So that's a really good point. And I read about a study rather this week, that was measuring pupil diameter in babies. And the reason it measured pupil
Oh,
diameter was because it's a measure of how much attention you're paying to something and what you're getting out of it, like how much you're getting out of it. And
oh,
what they found
that's
was,
interesting.
yeah, super interesting. And like this was on the heels of studies that had already validated and shown that chimps and babies have this natural innate proclivity to want to help when they see suffering. So that's
Mhm.
where we were starting to get the idea that compassion is this innate thing. That and many, 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 many studies have validated that it is innate. There's no arguing it. Like, unless you're born with that missing thing about empathy, the psychopathy thing, it's innate in you.
Yeah.
Compassion is innate, right? So uh but they started to learn, like, it's when you see someone suffering and you go to help them, that's compassion, right? And they get something out of it, and so do you, which is why it's this innate survival mechanism. But this study was so interesting because it showed that the babies who witnessed someone being compassionate had just as much pupil squint, paid just as much attention, got just as much reward out of seeing and witnessing the relief of suffering as the other babies did helping the relief of suffering happen. So even like seeing the compassion triggers the compassion, right? And so it's again, it's just to what you're talking about, right? Like when we see the numbers, we miss it. And if we can go down to the detail, then the compassion is triggered. And it's not even, we don't even have to like, I don't have to go to the war zone, right? But to tune into the witnessing can also bring on the compassion. To put a warning on that, as I say that, I'm hearing myself say that, and I'm wanting to make sure I mention like the people who tune in deeply to the news in order to bear witness to suffering, like make sure that you're tempering that with self-care, right? Because like you cannot contain the suffering of the whole world, but you can contain all of your suffering about the suffering of the whole world.
Yeah, I think that sometimes our compassion can like take us out, because you can care so much and then you can look at how like messed up the world is and get depressed over it. I mean, it's very overwhelming. It's very intense. And I think that the way to kind of channel that is to find small actions that feel meaningful, to interact with that. For example, like some people kind of will start to feel like, oh, I can't do anything. And while we can't save the whole world, there are things that we can do that matter. Especially while paying attention in itself matters, but also spreading awareness, also voting, also watching where your support goes with like your spending. Like, am I purchasing products that are potentially funding things that I disagree with? All of these things are small actions that we can pay attention to and channel that compassion into just everyday choices that we make. But also know that you don't have to do more than make choices in your life. You don't have to go out and save the world, and you don't have to feel like you're a terrible person because you can't go out and save the entire world in one fell swoop. All we can control is our individual choices on a day-to-day basis, and we can make sure that those choices are inspired by our compassion and care for other people.
Yeah, that is so right. And Sona's mentioning in the chat, she's talking about compassion fatigue, which it's like a phenomenon that comes up when you're trying to hold a compassionate stance to continue to relieve the suffering of others, but it's exhausting to you, right? Because it's
easily exhausting.
Yeah, and the part of the reason that it becomes exhausting, from my understanding, from my experience too, is when, you know, there's that adage, right? Like you can't love other people until you love yourself first. You can't pour from an empty cup. I actually don't think that's true. You can pour from an empty cup, and you can be compassionate and go through the motions and exercise compassion while not being compassionate with yourself. And it will still work, even potentially, to help those people that you're trying to help. And you will get exhausted. It will be exhausting to you, right? Because you're doing this compassionate thing that's not disingenuous. It's real for you. Like, I'm taking that away from people. Like, that it's authentic. You want to do this, right? But if you don't have the foundation of compassion towards self, then continual uninterrupted compassion towards others will lead to compassion fatigue. But if you are practiced at self-compassion, compassion fatigue isn't actually a thing. Compassion fatigue doesn't come because you've exhausted your capacity to be compassionate. Compassion fatigue comes because you've limited your ability to be compassionate only to the external. Instead, if you expand it to the internal, there will never be compassion fatigue, because compassion is an inexhaustible resource, but we feel exhausted by it because we limit it to others and not self.
Yeah, but it's a tough skill to develop. It's a very tough skill to develop. So it's not, I want to clarify that there's no shame if you're experiencing compassion fatigue. I think it's normal, it's common, and it's not your fault, but it is not an inherent side effect of being a compassionate person. Like, you don't have to experience compassion fatigue just because you care about other people.
Exactly.
We can develop a skill that helps reduce that. I'm not saying it's solvable in this moment. I'm not saying if you're feeling compassion fatigue that it can go away right now. I'm saying if we develop the skill of self-compassion, that experience of compassion fatigue will lessen.
Yeah, exactly. That's so right. And I'm so glad that you made this point clear, that if you're experiencing compassion fatigue, there is no shame in it. Like when I talk about the fact that compassion fatigue doesn't have to be a thing because it's not inherent in compassion, it's an aspirational philosophical discussion about where we are aiming to go in our consciousness as people so that we can transcend our suffering. It's not like if you're not here, you're not worthy. It's not that at all. It's more like, look at that beautiful place. Let's try to go there. You know what I mean? And some of us are going to go in a canoe and some of us are going to go in a rocket ship. It doesn't make a difference. Enjoy the ride, but that's where we're all headed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So shame does not help on a journey toward anything aspirational. Holding shame for where you currently are actually just short circuits that whole thing, which is again why we've landed on the conversation today that we have about compassion and then self-compassion.
Yeah.
Because part of self-compassion would be reducing shame.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're antonyms. They're complete opposites. You cannot get to compassion through shame.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And you know, another thing is like, so how then, right? How to become self-compassionate. We've talked about that in other episodes too, but like, this is the toughest nut to crack. Like to me, I consider like trying to become self-compassionate a life's work. Like it's a whole thing, you know, and yet it's also an oxymoron in a sense, because if we're talking about the definition of compassion and that's noticing the suffering of others and being willing to suffer with them, then how the hell can you be self-compassionate? You're alone, right? Like if the definition means to suffer with others, then how do we even do that, right? And so what occurred to me is it's that perspective taking thing, like because we allow ourselves to detach, we take the perspective and we suffer along with the parts of ourselves that suffer while holding untroubled space for them. So it's a nuanced thing, right? To go like, oh, I really want that. I'm going to use my sugar addiction again because it dogs me. I'm trying to overcome it, right? So, but it's like, there's this part of me that's like, oh, go get the latte. Go get the latte. Yeah. Okay, it's an innocent part. It wants Brian to feel good. So it's trying to make me feel good. Go get the latte. But there's another part of me that's like, well, getting the latte is going to be bad for your heart. And over long term, you don't want because of all the sugar. So that's a very nice logical part, right? And then there's another part of me that goes, fuck you. Don't get the latte, you stupid, weak-willed idiot. You're supposed to be spiritual, a life coach, and you can't get off the sugar. It's this one little time. You're going to let little white dust control your life like you're such a wimp. Whoa. Okay, so there's that guy too, right? The impatient.
You're so good at the shame voice. You're so good at it.
Because he's very well practiced and he hates my guts. So that's the thing about him. But the thing is, I also used to hate his guts, the one that would make me feel ashamed. And I've learned over time to find a way to sit with the complexity of the logical part of me that knows I should be healthier, the feel-good child that really wants that sugar, and the impatient critic that's like, fuck you both, no one's listening to me, right? Like to sit with all of that, the complexity within me, and go, you know what, Brian? Even with this childish desire for sugar, and even with this mean spirit toward that, and even with this logical one that you completely override, you're okay. You're safe. I get why this is all happening. I understand why you try to talk yourself out of sugar. And I understand why you want sugar. And I understand why you're getting tired of this struggle. And as you sit there and show yourself understanding in whatever way makes sense to you, you relax. In that place of relaxation, energy returns, which is why then compassion fatigue becomes less and less, because you get your own energy back, because you're not using all that energy to hold yourself down with the critic or with the logic or with the pattern recognizer or whatever all your little pieces of your psyche are.
Oh my gosh. That is such a good point, Brian, that you're like, your energy comes back when you stop fighting yourself. I feel like so many people are waking up every day and feeling just absolutely depleted, exhausted. I don't feel like I can get out of bed. I don't feel like I can, have energy to pursue any of my goals. Like there's how many people want to, get physically active and take better care of their bodies, but just the thought of it makes them feel like, oh, I don't have energy for that. And when you're not fighting yourself as much, when you don't have to like be battering with that shame voice and battering with all the different pieces of yourself, then like, I don't think people realize how much energy is actually getting devoted to that on a daily basis.
Yeah, we really don't.
Well, and I've
As I learn more about those parts, so much energy comes back. It's so crazy how much was
Yeah.
wound up in there.
Yeah, well, and you'll probably anybody who's watching you, you can think back to a time when you were feeling really conflicted about something where you had two parts of yourself that were like, "Oh, I think this is the right thing. I think this is the right thing, and I'll feel guilty if I do this, and if I do this, then I'm a bad person and blah blah blah." And you're fighting yourself and you can I'm sure you can think back to that time and ask yourself, "How much energy did I have in that time in my
Mm.
life when I was really feeling conflicted?" I bet it wasn't much. And it wasn't necessary. I mean, we could say it was because, oh, I was conflicted, so I wasn't sleeping enough, or so I was conflicted, so I was doing this other thing and that's why I was depleted, but don't discount the fact that the inner conflict itself is depleting.
Yeah, exactly. The inner conflict itself. That's very well said. It is
Yeah.
depleting to be in an internal struggle. Even if the internal struggle, it seems like it's quiet and serene to you and you're weighing options, right? Because that's what the mind is good at. It's good at weighing options and problem solving. And yet that's still exhausting if that's the only way that you go about trying to approach, right? And so self-compassion is also a way of like letting the mind off the hook, letting other
Mhm.
types of guidance show themselves within you. Like, how does your body feel about pushing forward right now? Like, one of the things that I read this week in terms of small ways you can show your self-compassion, it was so simple and logical, and it was like, rest when you're tired, right? But you won't
That's hard. It's hard.
and you won't know it from your mind. And since we live in the
Yeah.
mind all the time, the mind's not usually going, you're tired now, let's bag off for the day. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? That's your body going like that. And your mind is going, no, 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 there's more to achieve and do and impress people with. And it's
Yeah.
typing away, do it. Like, so your mind is not going to be the thing to remind you that you're tired, which is why you have to
Right.
tune into these other things, like your body, your heart, your spirit, whatever that means, right? You tune into these other aspects of felt experience. Those
Yeah.
aspects will tell you the truth. And so if your body tells you you're tired, if you learn to tune into it, and then you can actually stop and take a break because you've listened to it, that's self-compassion. That little tiny act right there.
Yeah. I work with, mostly high achievers, perfectionists, and in their case, your brain is never going to tell you to rest when you're tired because
Totally.
the first thing your brain's going to say when you're tired, that shame voice is going to come in and it's going to say, "Why are you tired? You shouldn't be tired." It's not going to say like you should rest. It will never tell you you should rest because it's always going to blame you for not being more productive, and it's not going to have any compassion towards the fact that your energy is low. It's not going to say, "Oh, like you're not feeling 100%, so you're not supposed to, do 100% right now." It's going to say, "Oh, you're not feeling 100%. There must be something wrong with you
Yeah,
because you're not at 100% of the time."
exactly. Because the mind is at 100% of the time. And the mind, like thinking about the mind as its own really separate piece of you that has its own understanding of the world, the same way your heart has its own understanding of the world. And so does your body, right? Your
Yeah.
mind's understanding of the world is that tiredness is an illusion and there's no such thing as tiredness because your mind does not get tired. It literally does not
No.
experience tiredness. You go to sleep and your mind goes, I'm going to dream. Like it doesn't bother to rest, right? And so when
Yeah.
another part of your being goes, well, I do need rest, your mind goes, you chump, that's for suckers. Rest doesn't even
Mhm.
exist. It's an illusion. Rest
Yeah.
is made up, but it's not. The mind just
Yeah.
doesn't know.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I had a story I wanted to share. This is not about self-compassion, but it's about compassion. And
Okay.
it goes to the heart of what you were saying earlier about like really remember the details on an emotional level, on an individual level, and how that compassion can inform and sprout and stay with us. Because I was 17 when this happened to me, and I was at a youth group event. This was in my born again Christian days. And I was really caught emotionally by something, you know what I mean? And I started bawling during this thing. Everyone's singing the worship song, and I'm just bawling. Right? And then that part ends, and suddenly it's not loud anymore, but I'm still bawling, right? And so suddenly it's like, whew, everyone's looking at Brian bawling, and I was like, oh, fuck, that's not how I meant this to go. You know what I mean? And
Uh-huh.
my friend Carolyn comes over to me and she takes me outside and I'm like crying with her and she's like holding me and then I'm like covered in snot and I'm like you know what I mean? I'm looking around for like something to deal with my mess. And she goes like this. And she just
Oh.
used her sleeve and cleaned up my face. And like, she didn't, it just was instinct. Like, it was no problem. There was no virtue signaling about it. Nothing. It was just, boom, I'm doing this. You need this. And it was instant compassion. Like, she was inspired to help because of my suffering. Like, it was the textbook definition of compassion. And I never forgot it, ever.
Yeah.
And it has stayed with me, and it has informed the way I show up when other people suffer.
Yeah.
That's how powerful compassion is. Gross, but beautiful at the same time.
I love that you gave the image of like taking your sleeve, because it like kind of helped me imagine how it would feel to be somebody that is receiving that level of compassion. And that's just amazing.
Actually, I'm sort of feeling it on my, like, I'm filling up a little as I tell you, and I didn't think that would happen. I've heard that, I mean, I've thought this story a lot. I've said this story before, but it actually is really still 29 years later, very, very meaningful to me, that moment. So, so compassion is very powerful. It takes deep, deep roots in the people who receive it, and it informs their behavior going forward. So you can know that too. Like, you are being a wizard or a magician or a sorcerer or a divine being or whatever you want to call it. When you spread compassion around, that's how magical it really is.
Yeah. Love it.
So there were a couple tips that we could talk about in terms of like how to cultivate it.
Yeah.
That I think might be useful for folks. So like, one thing is like this inner teacher, like reminding yourself that it comes naturally to you. Like, even if you don't believe it yet, like, it's okay that you might think the thought, compassion comes naturally to me. And you're like, that's not true. Okay, your mind is saying it's not true, but the science is saying that it is true. And so try to hold on to that, reminding yourself that it is an innate part of who you are. And then knowing that it's innate, you can take steps then to try to take the action from the innate compassionate instinct, which is here, right? And so as you notice that, you drop out of your thinking, you remind yourself compassion is innate, and you ask, what is that compassionate instinct in this moment? It will answer you because it's innate. You know what I mean? But it's also unconditionally supportive. So it doesn't jump up in the middle of your preconceived concept of self. You have to make room for it. So that's one. And then reframing envy is another one that I thought would be really useful to mention, because envy, kind of like shame, is oil to compassion's water. Like, you cannot be in envy and be in compassion, because compassion is earmarked by the desire to help, and envy is earmarked by the desire to possess, have, or tear down. So they're literally opposite in terms of the base level at which they come. So it doesn't mean that you run from envy. It's like every other conversation about emotions we've had for the last 12 weeks. Envy is a teacher, and it's instructive. So when you notice yourself in envy, the technique you use is to reframe the envy as an instructor, the same way I was talking about your inner teacher before, because the envy can actually help you gain awareness of a desire you hold. And it might not be the exact same thing, like, oh, I envy you because of your big house. So I don't actually want your big house, but maybe I want a bigger bedroom or a space with more light or whatever it is, right? So it's or it could be I want a house just like that. Whatever it is, though, the envy can instruct you as to a desire you hold, right? And then once you know that you have this desire, you can go about setting a goal for that desire or creating a plan. Like, you can use envy wisely, right? So experiencing the emotion of envy, just like experiencing the emotion of anger or whatever, is not the problem. It's not a problem. It's just when you allow it to fool you into thinking you should tear others down as a result of feeling the envy, that's when it becomes a problem. Instead, if you let envy become your guide, envy will lead you to an understanding of something that you want. And once you have that and you can start releasing envy that way, compassion comes back again. For the very thing you were envying before.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece of it is sometimes when you're feeling envious, you're also shaming yourself for not having something that the other people or whoever it is that you're comparing yourself to has. And so if we turn to compassion and say, like, I'm not supposed to be anywhere different than I am, or I shouldn't I shouldn't expect myself or shame myself for not having this thing. I'm okay where I am, but I'm also allowed to want more.
Yeah.
That takes you to a different place.
Yeah, and it's really tricky. So as folks hear us like giving you tips, right? Like know that as I try to have self-compassion, I struggle with this shame, envy cycle, this sticky loop of glue that
Yeah.
wants to hold me down, and then I envy something and then I'm ashamed at myself for it, and like all of that, right? None of that has to be a barrier for compassion, even though it's like oil to compassion's water. What it is an opportunity for compassion to show up and do its thing. That's always what to remember. Like nothing is an indicator that you don't deserve compassion. It's an
Yeah.
indicator that you need some right now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Did you have another one, or do you think that's a good place to wrap up? I liked it.
No, that feels like a good spot to wrap up for me. And, I have a quote from the Dalai Lama, which I'll say here, which is,
Awesome.
if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense to me.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think that the reason it makes sense is because compassion is an alleviator of so many negative emotions, so many like, and we want to be able to feel those negative emotions too. But if we can meet any negative experience with compassion towards both ourselves and others, and if we can practice and build up that muscle and that skill, you're going to feel better.
Yeah. And because compassion, for me, the way I look at it too, is it's not even like it is the alleviator of these negative emotions, but not because it cures them, but because the negative emotions feel more able to be felt. They feel less threatening in the presence of
Yeah.
compassion. So when you bring compassion online, you don't necessarily stop feeling the impatience or the anger, but you feel safer to feel that.
Yeah. You're not resisting it. And resisting is what amplifies
Yeah.
negative emotions. And when you have compassion, you can like feel it, but like feel it in a way that it doesn't compound on itself. It doesn't
Mhm.
get bigger or more intense or more scary. It just exists, and it exists in a way that it just kind of like dissipates.
Yeah. Because it's being accepted.
Hmm.
And in acceptance, we dissolve into. Like
Yes.
even think about like the human, like in a group, you know what I mean? Like when
Yeah.
you first go to a party and you're like, "Who it's a little weird," right? And then I'm shy, and then an hour in, like you're in, and you've dissolved into the party because you've been accepted. If you didn't feel
Yeah.
accepted, you would remain a wallflower. It's the same with our stuff, right? Like our emotions, like anger can dissolve into you through compassion because you've accepted it. But what we try to do is hold it out there, and then you have to keep experiencing it. It's in
Hmm.
dissolving that you stop
Yeah.
experiencing it because you've allowed the experience to come to its natural end. Is essentially
Yeah.
what you're doing with compassion. So, okay, we can leave it there, everybody, but because I feel like we could talk about compassion for another half an hour, but
We
uh,
could.
thank you everybody so much for being here and for cracking open this nut about emotions with us for the last 12 weeks. It's been
Yeah.
really, really informative for me. I've learned so much. And Morgan,
Me
I also
too.
want to thank you for all the little wisdom nuggets you've added and to help my journey. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you too. You did the exact same for me.
So all of you listening out there or watching from the past, present, or future, we love you. We appreciate you. And we will see you next week for a brand new season where we're going to talk about universal fears. So that'll be coming at you next week. Until then, be hot, be messy, and be blessed. Much love, everybody.